What's up, guys? Welcome back to the shop. It's great to have you here, and today I'm going to be showing you how to forge a rounding hammer. So the first thing I'm doing is starting off by cutting the material to length. I'm using 2-inch round 1045. I'm going to be cutting it to about 4¼ inches, and that's going to give me a nice 3.5-pound hammer once I'm done forging it. Now I'm just lighting the forge, and I'm going to let it get nice and hot before I put the material in there. Now the first thing I'm going to do is square up the material. You can forge a hammer with round material, but I just find it easier to square it up first. It makes it easier to mark the center where you're going to punch the eye, and I just like working with a square piece of material a little bit better. Now I'm using a cheap pair of calipers to scribe a center line on the piece, and then I'm going to use a center punch to mark the exact center just on one side. I'm primarily going to be punching through the top side of the hammer billet. Now I just came over to the press with my hammer eye punch, and I'm using a round punch because after I punch the hole, I'm going to take it back to the press with some flat dies and squish it from the sides, and it's going to turn that round hole into a perfectly oval hammer eye. So now what I'm doing is taking it over to the flat dies, and you can see me squishing the billet on its side, and that takes the round hole and makes it oval, and it makes it nice and centered, and you don't have to worry about the hole being crooked. Now I brought it over to this wedge block, and I'm starting off with a small drift just to get the hammer eye started. I'm going to take it, I'm going to flip it over, knock the drift out, and then come in from the other side. Now I'm using some fullering dies to forge in the trough lines of the hammer. Take your time when you're doing this step. It's very easy to make the trough lines crooked, and that kind of messes up the whole rest of the hammer. It makes it really difficult to correct that mistake. So definitely take your time while you're doing this step. And what this is going to allow me to do is then come in and forge in the cheeks of the hammer with the same exact fullering dies. I'm just back at the wedge block, drifting it one more time from each side. Sometimes when you're forging in those trough lines, it can squish the outside edges of the eye, and so it's good to pop the drift back in there and stretch it back out so you don't get any cold checks. So now I put the drift back in the hammer, and I'm forging out the cheeks of the hammer. Some people like to forge them out and stretch them out a lot. I like to keep the hammer a little more square, so I'm not forging them out too much. I'm kind of leaving the hammer pretty square and leaving them kind of thick. That's just the style I like, but you could do whatever you want. So now I moved up to a larger drift, and this is going to be the final drift for the hammer. And I'm coming in from one side, flipping it over, popping it back out, and then drifting it again from the other side, just to keep everything nice and even. Now I'm just squaring up all the sides of the hammer. This is just a style I like. Some people like the hammer to be more rounded. I like everything to be nice and square. It's really up to you, but this is just a style that I like to do lately. Now I'm coming back and cleaning up those trough lines for one final time. It's good to clean everything up, and especially when it gets to a slightly lower heat, you could kind of planish them a little bit and smooth everything out. It's a little harder to do that with a press. If I had a power hammer, it would really crisp everything up. But just due to the nature of the way the hydraulic press forges, you don't get quite as crisp lines as you would with a power hammer. Now I'm just using a cupping tool that my friend Kevin Facemeyer actually milled for me on his CNC mill. Make sure you guys go check him out. He makes awesome stuff for blacksmithing with his mill, and this cupping tool works great under the press. So now I'm going to come in and stamp my touch mark in there with the drift in the eye so it doesn't collapse. And then quickly before it cools down, I'm just going to clean up the trough lines one more time, just because I had enough heat left in the piece. And now I'm just finishing it off with a brush. So now I'm putting it in my heat treating oven for one normalizing cycle. You don't need a heat treating oven to do this. You could do it in the forge, but if you do have a heat treating oven, it's probably better to do it in there just because you can get a really precise temperature. Now I'm just letting it cool off a little bit. This basically just takes all the stress out of the metal that you put in there from forging and realigns the grain. And now I'm taking it over to the belt grinder to rough in the faces of the hammer. I'm using a 36 grit ceramic belt for this. And right now I'm using the platen for the square side of the hammer. And then later you'll see me switch over to a slack belt when I'm finishing up the round side of the hammer. Now you don't need a cupping tool to forge a rounding hammer. You could definitely just grind in the round face. I've done that plenty of times. But having a cupping tool helps out and saves you some work. So now I switched over to the slack belt and I'm grinding in the edges of the hammer. And I'm also grinding the round side. And I think I switched over to a higher grip belt at this point. I think about a 120 grip belt. Now I'm just using a die grinder with a carbide burr on there just to clean up the bottom side of the eye, which makes it easier to fit the handle in there. Now I'm putting it back in the heat treating oven so I could quench it. And I'm just heating it up to the same temperature. I'm pretty sure for 1045 it's 1555 degrees. And now I'm just quenching it in water. I'm making sure to really move it around vigorously because a steam pocket forms around the hammer and you want to break through that steam pocket so it cools faster. Because if you just let it sit in the water, it won't cool down fast enough to harden. Now I just took it over to my little Baldor buffer with a wire wheel on there. You could definitely use a wire wheel with a grinder, but I just bought this recently and I like the way it works, so I'm using that. And I'm just trying to get off all the scale and clean it up as much as possible and really make it nice and shiny. Now I'm using my oxyacetylene torch to temper the hammer. I'm focusing all the heat on the hammer eye and trying to temper that the most because that's the area I need to be the toughest and I don't need that to be hardened. And then the heat will kind of slowly leach out into the faces of the hammer and those will kind of turn into a straw color while the hammer eye will turn dark blue and almost gray. You don't want too much heat to go into the faces because then they'll end up turning too soft. Now I'm starting with the handle. I'm just using the belt grinder to rough in the part of the handle that's going to fit into the hammer eye. You could definitely use a draw knife for this or a rasp. You could really do it a million different ways, whatever's easiest for you, and with whatever tools you have available. So now I'm just doing a test fit, and it's good to do this a few times to finalize the fit of the hammer. I actually got it on the first try this time, which doesn't always happen. And I'm just popping it back out. Now I'm focusing on the shape of the actual handle. I like to make it a little thinner up top when you're choking up on the hammer, so you have a little bit more control when you're doing some fine work. And then it gradually gets thicker and thicker. So if you move down on the handle and you're really swinging hard, you have a nice thick handle to grab onto. But handle design is really a personal preference. It's up to you. You could really do whatever you want. But this is just what I like to do for my handles. Right now I'm using a 40 grit belt, and then I move up to a 100 grit belt to smooth out all the rough sanding marks. And then I end up hand sanding it with a 220 grit pad. Right now I'm going over to the bandsaw to cut the slot for the wedge. You could definitely do this with a handsaw, but the bandsaw makes it a lot easier. So now I'm putting the final grind on the hammer. I'm starting off with a 120 grit belt. And I'm using the slack belt again for the round face and the edges of the square face. Now I switched over to a Scotch-Brite belt, and that's great to put a nice kind of satin finish on the hammer. It makes everything nice and smooth, and it looks really good. I'm making sure I get all the edges so it's a nice consistent finish. Okay, so now it's time to actually put the hammer onto the handle, and I'm using this little hydraulic press that I made with a bottle jack. You could definitely do this the traditional way, just by pounding the handle in with another hammer, but I like to use this just because it's a lot harder to crack the wooden wedge with this thing. A lot of times when you're using a hammer, you could crack the wooden wedge, and this also gives me a much tighter fit. Now I'm using a walnut wedge for this, and I'm putting some wood glue on the wedge just to make sure it stays in there a lot longer. I'm getting it started with a little hammer, and then I'm going to put it under the press and press it in. Now I'm just going to take it over to the grinder, clean it up a little bit. And I'm also going to use a circular metal wedge, just for a little bit of extra security. Now I'm just going to give it one last final sanding, just to get any stains out that I may have put in the wood with my dirty hands. Then I'm just going to use some boiled linseed oil on a rag and give it a nice coating of that oil just to protect the handle and make sure it doesn't dry out. Making sure it really soaks in the end grain. And also I like to rub it in the head just to protect the metal, make sure it doesn't rust. And it also darkens it up a little bit. Alright guys, I really hope you enjoyed today's video. Make sure you like this video, comment down below, and also don't forget to subscribe to my channel. I make new videos every week. And also make sure you check out my Patreon on my website. The links to those two things are down in the description as well. If you would like to buy a hammer or any other tool, make sure you check out my website. I have all sorts of cool stuff on there, and I have lots of different tools, including hammers just like this. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next video.